Hi there, it's Gabrielle Nicolay from SpeechKids, where we teach little kids to talk and help parents understand their little kids. And today I am so delighted to be talking to Sara Rosenfeld Johnson, who is a giant in the field of speech language pathology. Sara, thank you so much for being here.
It is my great pleasure.
We're going to talk about your career, but I just wonder if you wanted to introduce yourself briefly and tell the good people who you are and what you do.
I am. Okay. I am a speech language pathologist. I'm also a mother of 3, a grandmother of 8, a wife of 1. So lots of different hats that I've worn. I started out a long time ago. I have recently retired, but I do conversations like this. Every once in a while, I teach a class, but primarily my focus has been in muscle-based deficits, whether it be with infants, young children, with the geriatric population. So I've really looked at how muscles impact on speech. That's really been my focus.
And that started, correct me if I'm wrong, in the 80s when you were working. No. Oh, tell me.
That actually started in the 70s. I had the great opportunity to be at Columbia University when it was a very small department. And I had a mentor there who, Edward Mystique, and I don't even know if the people now even know who this man was. He died very young. He was probably the first oral motor therapist that lived. He was my professor. And he talked about muscles. He was wonderful. He used to come into class acting like the diagnosis that he was going to be talking about that day. So for example, when he did cerebral palsy, he walked in as someone who had difficulty moving his body and talked in that pattern. And then he would say to us, close your eyes and listen to my speech. And he would be using that speech pattern. But then he would say, open your eyes and I'm going to continue talking, but without sound. And I want you to look. What is it that you see? Not only what you hear, but what is it that you see? And I realized at that point that learning the physiology was one thing, but actually seeing how a muscle moved on a particular speech sound was phenomenal. So it started 1971, actually.
Well, that guy sounds like an amazing professor.
And you can still get his book on I think eBay sometimes. I don't think Amazon has it anymore, but it's incredible. He talked about that sensory motor connection, that what you say, you hear, and what you hear, you say, and that modifies it. And he just opened up our eyes, as there were only 9 of us in that particular class. And he just said, don't only believe what you read, believe what you see and what you experience. And it was a very different lesson than is being taught in graduate schools now, I think. And that's what I've seen over the years. We were taught there are 3 ways to do things. One, you can do something with your client and you find that it doesn't work. Well, what are you going to do? You could do it again because it's based on research and someone told you that's what you had to do, which is a waste of time. You could discharge the client, but that makes no sense because they need help. And the third was you can figure it out. You can try, you can experiment. And that's, I think, what you're referring to is in the 80s when I finally found a place that allowed me to do that as a professional. And that was, yes, in the actually, I think early 80s, late 70s, maybe even.
Probably
I can't remember
was,
when I got that job.
Yeah.
But he started it. And then the next phase was being allowed to do it, having the confidence. As a young therapist, you're not so gutsy. Some are, I wasn't. I tried the old way. I said, okay, this is what I taught. This is what I taught. This is what I was taught. And then it didn't work. And then I said, let's try something new. What's the worst thing that can happen? It won't work. Okay, doesn't work. But then it did work. And then when it worked, it was like, oh, wow, this is great. This worked. Let me try it again.
Okay, so what was the thing, what were, like, pick one thing, because there were many things, but what were some of the things that worked? Who were you doing it with? Why did you do it? And tell us all the things.
Okay. All right. So I focused primarily at the beginning of my career with children. So I would work with special needs kids. That was my focus. I loved working with special needs kids. And I would look at the muscles that they were using to speak. And here you have an OT and a PT working on muscle movement. And the speech pathologist was saying, look at me, listen to me, say what I say. And these kids couldn't get it. They just looked at me like, what are you talking about? No, watch me again. Ball. And they would go, buh. And I would go, ball. And they would go, buh. And I thought, am I going to do this for the next 40, 50 years as a career? I will die. I will kill myself. So that became the focus of how do you get those lips together? And the connection between speech and feeding started really early for me because I had the opportunity to work in a facility where I met your mom and where I worked with an OT and a PT. And we looked at the connection between feeding and speech, because if you can't say ball with your lips, you're probably sticking your tongue out on a spoon to remove food from a spoon.
But what made you think that? Why?
The connection?
Yeah. Was it just completely obvious? Like,
it was so obvious. It's your mouth. You know, if your mouth can't move one way for feeding, how are you going to plan? Speech is so much more complex. And you don't have the same sensory feedback with feeding. Your motivation is very high. That spoon is the sensory that makes your lips close. You don't think about it when you eat. Your lips just automatically close. So that connection between feeding and speech was so obvious to those of us who were working with it at that time. And we had no clue that nobody else was doing this. We had no idea. We thought, oh, this is
just how it is.
Super figuring obvious. This out. Yeah, it's really, but we were also in a facility where our boss, who was a special ed director, she said, do whatever you want. As long as it doesn't hurt somebody, try to figure it out. And that thing from Dr. Mystique, figure it out, came back to me and said, okay, let's figure it out. And don't be afraid to fail, because if you fail, you've learned that won't work. And you're not going to succeed if you don't keep trying things to figure things out. So we were given carte blanche to try anything. And our successes were just reinforcing. That was the most wonderful part about it. And that we would look at a child, and I think that was the other thing that was so different. When I was in graduate school as a young therapist, this is what we worked on: your head. You know, this was all you looked at. This was it, what was happening in your head. You learned the muscles in your head. But working with an OT and PT, you learn very quickly that what's happening in the body is also happening and determining what's happening in the face and the mouth and the head, and that it's all connected. We're not, OTs work on hands, PTs work on legs, speech people work on mouths. It just never made sense to any of us. And then we had an aide who would take all of our goal, whatever that goal was. Let's say it was lip closure. I'm working on an M sound. The OT is working on lip closure on the spoon. So let's say we have that. Then the aide would continue working on that with the kids when we weren't doing it. And then they'd also be working on singing, using those movements in your mouth for singing. So these kids were getting bombarded with lip closure without actually telling them. And then in my speech sessions, we would use that lip closure and teach vocabulary for the MB and P. It just made such sense to us. It was great.
Integrated. And it's funny because I think this is an idea it's starting to creep back or come around, or whatever you want to call it, this mind-body connection. As much is made about, right? Mind, body. We're in our bodies. We got to feel our bodies. We got to deal with our bodies. Okay, fine. But for a long time, certainly when I was in grad school, we weren't talking about like the kinesthetics, the sensory piece of speech and language. No. And we certainly weren't talking about sort of, the brain and how it, anyway, it's a whole,
Well, you know,
a
the
deep dive.
frustrating part for me is that in 1971, Ed Mystique was talking about that. And then for whatever reason, our profession just ran into language and they stopped looking at speech. And it was so sad because we had these kids that would just start here, you know, they'd have no speech and no language. And then we would teach them language, 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 language. And they would have this gap because they would want to say, I want more, and it would come out like this. So the gap is where this profession of oral motor therapy, or what my particular brand is called oral placement therapy, fills that gap. It makes you don't only work on language, you work on speech, movement, and speech at the same time.
Yeah.
So you're right, it's coming around, but it's really so sad that we lost it. You know, back in the early 80s, that it just seemed to be, let's just do language, but it's coming back.
So I want to know about the tools. So when you were working with the kids, you were using...
My first two, you know, what did I start with? Okay. I had a kid who I wanted to say the word want. Okay. I was working with this kid and I would say, look at me, want. And he'll go, want. And I would go, no, use your lips, want. And he would do this, want. So he wasn't getting the feedback that he needed to know that his lips were in a certain position. So I said, okay, well, let's think about this. What can you put in a child's mouth, which is safe, which is motivating, and is going to give you lip rounding? And the obvious answer became a straw. So my first techniques were using straws just to get lip rounding, and then using it to drink, and then using it without liquid, and then bringing the straw to the mouth, and the child would learn. So you're phasing out the tool. Okay, hurry, want. And all of a sudden he went, oh, want. And you know, I think that one of the compliments that the OT in this particular group gave me is she said, most speech pathologists are not task analyzers. You say, I want someone to say the sound, and you immediately say the sound. I go from, where is the child now? What do I want them to do? And I create 5 or 6 steps in between using sensory, phasing out the sensory, and then the child can learn it. So it's almost like, you know, if I said to you right now, or anybody who is listening, I want you to stand up and I want you to move your feet 20 paces using only one movement. Just go one for 20, just fly, right? Fly. Okay. What would you say? I can't do it.
I can't do it. Yeah.
Okay. But I make you do that every day. Every day. Now you're going to get frustrated. Your parents are going to get frustrated because I'm sending that home for homework. And I'm going to get frustrated. And that's why so many people in my age group left therapy, speech therapy, because we weren't getting the reinforcement that we needed for ourselves. And with oral placement therapy, not only is the therapist seeing changes, the parent, but most importantly is the child. And every single session, they see an improvement in a skill. Yeah. So it's so much fun. And when you break it up in those little pieces, the kid every single time goes, oh, this is great. I used to do this one time in my career. I was in a public school for a couple of years doing this kind of therapy with a group. And there are 8 straws in the hierarchy. And I made little stickers, pictures of each of the straws. So that when you would complete that particular straw, because there's criteria that go with it, we would have a ceremony. I put a crown on the kid's head. They'd be walking around, you know, really feeling good. And I had this one little kid, I'll never forget, is Jeremiah. And what he did was he walked out of the class, out of the therapy session. He was walking back to his room. He was in 2nd grade, typical kid, because this morphed from special needs into typical. And he was walking down the hallway with his sticker on his shirt, and he goes, I got straw number 3. I got straw number 3. And he's singing along, and I'm thinking, this is a kid who hated to come for therapy for such a long time because he always felt like he couldn't handle it.
Couldn't handle it. This is huge, Sarah. And I just want to first of all, I think you're right about sort of the task analysis piece of it. If that's not something that comes naturally, it's certainly not a lot of what gets taught in school. And so it's this, we got taught a bunch of principles, and we got taught a bunch of theories, and then we got taught some skills. Right. But task analysis of sort of breaking down these different movements, these different sensory stimuli, that was really groundbreaking at the time. Nobody was thinking about it that way. And
Correct.
so,
and that's why
right?
when I wrote my first book and I task analyzed 40 different therapy techniques and how you transition that movement into speech, when the person read, we had a lot of readers on the book before it was published, people would come back to me and say, Sarah, the steps are so small. And I said, yes, but you can go through these steps fast because you have normal muscle skill. And they will go, well, you don't need excessive skill or strength in a muscle, right? But you do need adequate, and you need that that reinforcement that what you're doing is correct. So in that first book called Oral Placement Therapy for Speech Clarity and Feeding, it is for some redundant, for others critical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think not everybody is as committed to task analysis. I mean, mm-hmm. I've been married, my husband and I have been married for 47 years, and you do not want to live with me. I am an anal person. I am. For years, when we would travel, we would go into toy stores, and I would say, what can I put into this kid's mouth that's going to make them do this? All of this. But that's my personality. Mm-hmm. So the fact that I've done that mm-hmm. is almost to me like a gift to people who don't want to or don't have the time to do it. Yeah. It's wonderful. Take it
well,
all.
And I will say, I'm looking, in fact, one of my computer is sitting on Assessment and Treatment of the Jaw by Sara Rosenfeld Johnson. And I have it with me at all times because it's literally like, it's a how-to manual.
Right.
You take the thing and okay, this is what we're doing. Okay, this is where we are. This is where we're going. And it's not that, and when as I say that, I don't mean to say like that, this is some flippant cookbook that we just kind of choose at random. No, but the way in which tasks are broken down, and for any child who's struggling, which by definition, all of my kids are on our caseloads, they're so used to failure that if we don't get them to success really quickly, they're going to check out.
Exactly.
And so that's like the most important thing in therapy, regardless of what technique you use and all of that. Like, we can argue about sort of the particulars in terms of therapy techniques. Although I completely agree with you in terms of the language and the speech stuff. That child has to be motivated, and that child has to be successful.
I remember I had a naysayer at some point during my career, because there were many who would look at me. Oh yeah, many. And I remember one of them in particular was speaking at a convention, an ASHA convention, and said, bubble blowing has nothing to do with speech. Okay, so on the surface, you could say bubble blowing could be a reinforcer. So kids like it, and maybe you could do something and whatever. But when you do what is called therapeutic bubble blowing, you take a breath in, you use abdominal grating to direct the air up through the laryngeal passage, you round your lips, and you use a prolongation of airflow. Isn't that speech? I mean, that's what I use for dysfluencies. That's what I use for voice therapy. Let's get the feel of air, and then we can put a sound to it, a letter to it, a sequence to it, but let's feel. And I guess when my son-in-law took over TalkTools, we talked about how do you really describe what this is? Mm. And it's the feel of speech. Mm. If you have a child who is going to learn to talk through, look at me and listen to me, say what I say, they probably would learn from their parents. They do that all the time.
They would have done it already.
Don't you think? So this feel of speech. So many of these kids are tactile. These kids who constantly put things in their mouths. What are they saying to you? You know, instead of looking at those behaviors and saying that is a bad behavior, if you look at that behavior and you say, why? Well, that child is seeking sensory information through the mouth. Well, if that's the case, let's give them something in the mouth. It's going to allow them to feel what we want them to do, get reinforcement for that, and then attach the sound to it.
Yeah.
It does. It just, you know, I've taught for many, many years, close to, I'm thinking 1992 was my first lecture.
Okay.
So I've taught to a lot of people in a lot of countries. And what I think is so dramatic about this work is that when a therapist who is maybe coming in not knowing what any of this is about, and you can almost see them in the audience, you know, they sit back, they're listening, not really sure. They come up to you at the end and they go, you know, this makes sense. Then you know that you have really opened up somebody's mind to something as a potential to try. And that's what I always say to my classes. Try it. If it doesn't work for you, fine. There is not one technique that works for everybody. If that was the case, why would we go to undergraduate or graduate school? Just take one class. Just take one class.
Only be one technique if there was
Solve all
only
your
one
problems.
technique that worked. That's right.
Exactly.
I love that. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Well,
yeah,
I have
this is
certainly had the benefit of having it make sense very early in my career. And so I am so, number one, appreciative of your work in general, but also of your sort of presence in and out of my life as I was growing into this profession. And it's just, I think it's a tremendous legacy. And I appreciate you taking the time today, but I also, I speak for many of us when I say that we appreciate you having done the work.
Well, thank you. You know, that is a wonderful thing to hear. No matter how old you are, no matter what anybody says, it always feels good when someone says, you did a good job.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, it was nice to see you again.